How can oppositional movements with dissimilar strategies reconcile to unite the front against domination and subjugation? Chela Sandoval suggests in the second chapter of her book Methodology of the Oppressed that the theory of differential social movement derived from U.S. third world feminism is a revolutionary model to progress past ideological differences toward egalitarian society and government. Sandoval describes oppositional consciousness as the various understandings of what resistance should look like, and these arise from distinct marginalized experiences. She believes one's experience is unique based on circumstances like race, gender, sex, geographical location, age, and class, and these varying experiences give way to different resistance ideologies. Sandoval identifies 5 major categories of this oppositional consciousness, or methodologies taken up by the oppressed. The first form is the equal rights form, in which participants argue that their branded inferiority is based on physical differences only and not based in reality, of course. They argue that they have equal capacity as their oppressors, and thus, quote, these oppositional actors argue for civil rights based on the philosophy that all humans are created equally, end quote. Sandoval describes this form interchangeably as liberal consciousness, and in some ways, it is often chronologically the first emergent version of a cause's oppositional philosophy, and it is the least disruptive. The second form of oppositional consciousness is the revolutionary form, and this almost does the exact opposite of the former. Rather than just insist on equality, it, quote, identifies, legitimizes, claims, and intensifies the differences, end quote, of the lived experiences and identities of the marginalized population, with the aim of holistic liberation and self-determination. The third form is the supremacist form, in which, quote, the oppressed not only claim their differences, but they also assert that their differences have provided them access to a higher evolutionary level than that attained by those who hold the social power, end quote. And this reclamation aims toward the penetration of the oppressed into the leadership of the regime. Sandoval also describes it as the radical or cultural phase of resistance. The fourth oppositional consciousness that is most commonly found within the oppressed of capitalist societies is the separatist form, in which participants advocate for the complete separation of the marginalized group from the ruling institution, and thus claim full autonomy and sovereignty instead of equality or revolutionary change to the existing system. The problem with these various forms is that ultimately, because of the very distinct strategies and stances they occupy, they don't achieve the level of intersectionality needed for mass mobilization and union against the common enemy of the oppressed, settler colonialism and patriarchy. The ultimate form of oppositional consciousness, which reconciles all of the shortcomings and contradictions from the previous forms in itself and operates in tandem with them all, is the differential form of social movement, and this is Sandoval's very thesis. This form, quote, enables movement between and among ideological positionings considered as variables in order to disclose the distinctions among them, end quote. The point is to allow for pluriversality among the 4 forms of resistance, acknowledging that depending on the current political climate, different strategies and rhetoric will be most effective against the common enemy and for the mobilization of all. We can use Sandoval's theory of differential social movement to analyze Zora Neale Hurston's novel Their Eyes Were Watching God, from a unique angle that allows us to track the evolution of protagonist Janie's gradual internal philosophy of resistance and autonomy. Upon reflection of both sources, I found that the phases of Janie's life across her 3 marriages and her eventual independence represent the same progression of the 4 major forms of oppositional consciousness. Janie was a non-confrontational young woman toward the beginning of the novel, and although she hardly spoke up to her grandmother or her first husband Logan, as readers we are granted some insight into the unhappiness festering within her, and her coming to consciousness of the unfairness of her situation, married to a harsh man that's constantly ordering her about. She is hurt at the fact that Logan treats her as an object of his ownership, still in the midst of wishing for romance and male validation for her existence. She was then experiencing the equal rights form of oppositional consciousness, desiring to be treated as an equal and as a wife more than a servant. To fulfill this aim, she runs away with a man who promises to treat her as such, called Joe Starks. As she transitions into a new phase of her life as the wife of a mayor, she discovers that financial security and high status don't liberate her from the acute misogyny of another oppressive husband. Joe spends 20 years forcing Janie to hold her tongue, hide her hair, body, and spirit. Over the years, Janie's internal philosophy solidifies into something closer to her truth and adjacent to the revolutionary form of oppositional consciousness. She realizes the inevitable differences between man and woman, and realizes that neither Joe nor any man can ever understand the mind and experience of a woman. And she becomes more empowered with the realization that she still has her nature and herself and her distinction, even when Joe tried to murder it for so long. And eventually she confronts him about his tyrannical behavior and his obliviousness of the feminine mind. After Joe dies, Janie's oppositional consciousness evolves further into the supremacist form. At last, she's reclaiming some pride as an independent woman, existing day to day without the presence of a man in her life. And although her autonomy is incomplete, as she still feels trapped in the small town and store, we see a drastic shift in her personality as she finally takes a major decision for herself, for the first time in so many years when Tea Cake comes into her life. She ignores the community's criticisms that she should be grieving her late husband or that she was too old for the young man. And in her newfound air of confidence and relief at her escape from Joe, she follows her desires and marries Tea Cake, now in somewhat of a position of power in their relationship as the older and wealthier individual. Finally, after Tea Cake's death, Janie's oppositional consciousness graduates to the separatist form, in which she is literally separated not only from her husband, but from the binds of a relationship with any man for the remainder of her life. She is finally in a state of peace, content with the fact that she's experienced true love in her life, and she's ready to accept herself as her only companion. She is far past the point of believing in equality between man and wife, past the dream of having a revolutionarily different marriage, because although her relationship with Tea Cake was an improvement from her previous marriages, it was still tainted with hints of infidelity, domestic abuse, and misogyny. She's at the point of separation, knowing that the greatest extent to which she might find liberty from patriarchy is by herself. Janie's life story was a tragic and profound one that concluded with what I find to be the most beautiful version of an ending it could have had. But what could Janie's life have looked like if she had transformed her consciousness into the differential form, the final form? Armed with the realization that to survive and prevail under the wicked game of patriarchy, she must manipulate her rhetoric according to her audience and employ different strategies at different moments when dealing with distinct men, changing tactics depending on the personality and habituations of each. She might have discovered something like liberty earlier on, or at least might have more effectively stood her ground. To take Sandoval's theory a bit further, the 4 forms of oppositional consciousness develop chronologically and in order of increasing autonomous and radical intensity, as demonstrated through history and even in the parallels found across Janie's life. The 5th and most effective differential form calls for the strategic employment of all forms at the opportune moment of each, to achieve total liberation from the tricky and oppressive systems ailing the human race.